John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is one of the most famous and influential utilitarian defenses of individual liberty. And John Stuart Mill is a 19th century English economist and political philosopher. Mill comes from a line of very famous economists and political philosophers. His father was James Mill, who was an economist, and his godfather, David Ricardo, was one of the founders of modern classical economics. John Stuart Mill, by age 4, was said to be able to speak and write Latin and Greek. He went to college at age 13 overseas in France, and later in the UK at 16. He, throughout his life, served as a member of the East India Company as a bureaucrat, and he was also elected to Parliament. He was very well known for his advocacy of classical liberalism, as an early advocate of women's rights, and in particular, and voting rights for both the working class and women. Now, John Stuart Mill made many contributions to political thought, but perhaps his best known is called the harm principle. And the harm principle is summed up very simply. The only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. Now, the harm principle is the conclusion of a three-pronged argument about 1. The value of individual freedom, 2. The disvalue of coercion, and 3. The conditions necessary for human progress. So let's go through these three aspects in order. Let's talk about the value of freedom. Freedom, for John Stuart Mill, is instrumentally valuable to achieving the goal of subjective happiness. Now remember, Mill is a utilitarian, and so for him, the end goal of all moral thought is the happiness of the individual. Now, instrumental here means that individual freedom acquires its value because it is an instrument or a tool to achieve a certain goal, namely freedom. Why is this? Well, Mill builds off a couple of basic observations. He starts off with the premise that all individuals are at least somewhat different in what makes them happy. 2, he says that becoming happy for most individuals is an exercise in self-discovery. It is not something that comes naturally to us. It is not something that's instinctual. It's something that we have to discover. So, to be happy, I have to find out what makes me happy. But I can only find that out through trial and error and experimentation. Pleasure and pain, he says, are creatures of the senses, and so it's only through my own senses that I can learn what brings me pleasure and pain. The liberty to pursue different experiments in living is the only way anyone can discover happiness. Note here that while liberty to pursue experiments seems to be a genuine precondition to individual experimentation, and therefore happiness, Mill doesn't say too much about individuals who refuse to experiment, and in so doing, get in the way of their own happiness. Liberty is certainly necessary to happiness, but it's not obviously sufficient. In other words, you actually have to experiment. You have to actually use your liberty if you're going to be happy. Okay, so maybe I have to experiment to find out what makes me happy. But how do I know what to try? There's going to be many lifestyles and experiments to try. You could spend a lifetime failing to become happy before hitting on something successful. Mill says the only way human beings will progress in discovering what makes them happy is if they can learn from the successes and mistakes of others. Now this has a very interesting implication. This means that not only must I be free, but I benefit from others being free as well. So it's an argument not just for the subjective liberty, that is to say the liberty of one individual, but it's an argument for the liberty of everyone. Okay, so freedom is good. But Mill doesn't stop there. He also makes a case against coercion, and he makes a three-pronged case why coercion is bad. 1, he says coercion is not a teacher. 2, coercing entities like governments seldom have adequate information. And 3, coercing entities, not only do they not have enough information, but they also don't have adequate incentives. Let's go through these three arguments. Coercion is not a teacher. Well, Mill says that if people are truly to learn, they need to be persuaded. Coercion can certainly modify behavior. And coercion can even modify opinion to some degree. To the extent that people see that something is a law, they might be well disposed to thinking that breaking it is wrong. But what coercion cannot do is teach the reasons why an action is wrong. In other words, it can't reform people from the inside for the right reasons. So he says, whenever possible, we are better off trying to persuade people to abandon courses of action rather than we are better off trying to persuade people to abandon courses of action, since that way they're going to do it on their own in the future rather than constantly needing to be threatened before they behave in the way that either benefits them or benefits everyone. From the point of view of society, mistakes that people make are often as important as the successes. That is to say, we learn from our mistakes, we learn from the mistakes of other people, and so from the point of view of society, even though it might be bad for you if you make a mistake, it might be good for society that you made a mistake, because it might be the case that everybody gets the opportunity to learn from your mistakes. And so, again, that gives you an argument for allowing people to be free, and particularly free to make mistakes, to do things that almost everybody thinks are a bad idea. And of course, since societies are always in progress, what was a failure a long time ago may prove to be workable today. And vice versa, things that used to be successful, that used to make people happy, might no longer make them happy. And so again, that provides a good argument for not enshrining into law particular ways and methods of being happy, because society is constantly moving forward, and so what was applicable a century ago may no longer be today. A second prong of Mill's argument for the disvalue of coercion is that coercing entities seldom have adequate information upon which to base their coercion. Mill notes that you probably have a very good idea of what makes you happy. More importantly, he thinks that even if you don't have a very good idea of what makes you happy, it's not clear that anybody else has a better idea about what makes you happy. So Mill says, because we have better access to the content of our hearts and preferences than anyone else, that's a good case for not interfering in our decisions, at least where those decisions don't affect other people. What coercion does, especially coercion for an individual's own good, is that it substitutes someone else's judgment for the individual's. Final argument that Mill deploys against coercion is that coercing entities seldom have adequate incentives, even where they have excellent information. So, in addition to not having access to our preferences, any coercive entity probably has very different interests to our own. Even a democratic government, which is authorized by the people and runs, hopefully, in their interests, at best is going to be running off the preferences of the majority. And the majority may have no interest in your individual happiness or self-development. If anyone has very good incentives to change their behavior towards making you happy, it's going to be you. So, from the point of view of trying to make people happier, which, remember, is always the ultimate goal for someone like Mill and any utilitarian, coercion seems to substitute someone with good incentives to make you happy, you, the judgment of someone with good incentives, your own individual judgment, with someone with less good incentives, namely a government or some other external entity. So, when considering Mill's argument for the disvalue of coercion, what we have is a fairly weak argument against coercion per se. But what we have is a very strong argument against coercing people when their activities really harm no one else but themselves. Right? The fact that you have the best knowledge of what makes you happy and you have the best incentives to make yourself happy doesn't mean you won't use your freedom to harm others. That's why it's a fairly weak argument against coercion per se, that is to say all coercion. But it is a fairly good argument against coercing you when you harm no one else, because again, you have the best incentives to improve and you have the best knowledge of the situation. Or, to put it another way, you have relatively better knowledge than anybody else and relatively better incentives than anyone else. So, what this argument in favor of freedom and against coercion amounts to is a defense of the conditions necessary for human progress. Mill imagines that even if rules of good conduct were assigned to us, and they were in fact the right rules, that is to say, these were rules that would in fact make us happy, a problem of uncertainty would still remain. That is to say, we would not really be justified in thinking that any rules were the right rules until we had experimented with them and other ways of living. So Mill's case here is what we call epistemic. Epistemic has to do with the origins of knowledge and understanding. It's not just that liberty will give us a better shot at being happy, it's that only liberty can give us a justification for thinking we are right in our judgments about what makes us happy. Another way of putting the same point is that restrictions on liberty are going to be assumptions of infallibility on the part of government. They effectively say, we know the truth, and you don't. Mill ties this argument for freedom to what he thinks are the basic conditions for human development and progress. And what he's essentially doing is applying the scientific method to political discussion and progress in opinion. He says in On Liberty, complete liberty of contradicting and disproving our opinion is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth for the purposes of action, and on no other terms can a being with human faculties have any rational assurance of being right. So Mill's case for free speech is a kind of application of the scientific method to our own way of life. We don't know, for example, whether scientific theories are valid unless they're open for testing and debate. And for Mill, the same is true for our way of life and our opinions. The best security for knowing that our opinion is right is that everybody has the liberty to contradict us. And through that process of open competition of ideas, you might say, Mill thinks the truth is more likely to win out. Let me give a final comment on liberty. It's worth noting, I think, that John Stuart Mill is very sensitive to the fact that both governments and other individuals can be threats to individual liberty and self-development. Sometimes the government may have to stand in the way of public opinion, or in some cases, employers, not employees, employers that attempt to interfere too much with the self-regarding activities of citizens. So he really understood that freedom wasn't just what happens when government gets out of the way, it's what happens when governments carve out legal spaces for each and every one of us to live a life that is of our own creation. Now, in practice, how much government needs to do to make freedom real for everyone is actually a question that Mill struggled with quite a bit throughout his life, and he changed his mind. When he was young, Mill was very much a classical liberal, and he tended to think that the threats to individual liberty were primarily coming from government. But towards the end of his life, Mill became more of a social democrat in his stance and took a more activist stance as to what the government could do in order to help us be free. This debate goes on among liberals today. That is to say, today you have classical liberals who believe that the primary threats to individual liberty are governmental, and you have what they call high liberals or more egalitarian liberals who see the government as being one of many threats to individual liberty, and therefore see the role of government as being potentially constructive in protecting individual liberty.